Shawn Levy, I checked out his, is it your blog that has dad, writer, film guy, soccer fan, Portlander, Farsoonerite? I don't understand that one. Oh, okay.
Farsoonerite is someone who would far sooner do something than something else.
Okay. Farsoonerite and Born to Tweet. So, and everybody can go to ShawnLevy.com, right? That's where I found it. So that was kind of funny. I enjoyed looking at that. Levy, he lives in Portland, and he's written 7 books of biography and cultural history, including the New York Times bestsellers, The Paul Newman, A Life, Come On In, and Rat Pack, Confidential. He has been writing he wrote for the Oregonian since 1992, and he served as the film critic from 1997 to 2012. He reviews movies for KGW-TV, and he blogs at ShawnLevy.com. His latest book, De Niro, The Life and the Work, will be published by Crown. When's that coming out? This year?
End of October.
End of October. So be looking for that. And I have 2 stories. One, I asked him, I said, I have to do this introduction, and I hate to say, no, he went to Penn, then he went to school at, University of California, but I don't like doing that. So he sent me this, and these are his words. He says, I can tell you that I moved to Portland in 1992, driving from California with my wife, a Portland native, and young boys in a Subaru loaded with everything we needed. We passed the sign in the, okay, Robert, how do you say that word?
Siskiyou.
Thank you. Not from around here. I don't know how to say this. He tried to do it phonetically for me, and I really was blowing it. So I said, okay, I'm just going to, say, okay, Robert, you say that word. Thank you. And it says, that said, welcome to Oregon. And I thought to myself, if I could only be film critic of the Oregonian and write books, I'd have it made. And absolutely true. So the second story, I was talking at the reference desk, and the reference librarian says, Shawn Levy, isn't he that critic, that film critic? And I'm like, yeah. And she writes for the Oregonian, and I said, yeah. She says, oh, my daughter Maddie, who is now 22 years old, when she was 12, had to write a report on a film star, well, anyone, and she chose Audrey Hepburn. So she emails the film critic for the Oregonian. And he writes her back and gave her all this information and explained why he thought, or what, the pros and cons of Audrey Hepburn as a film star, as an actress. And this was 10 years ago, and as soon as I said your name, she's like, oh, he helped Maddie doing it, and this was when she was 12. So anyway, Shawn Levy, thank you for coming.
Thank you. I wish I knew that happened. But thank you so much for the invitation. There's a punchline to the story about driving over the Siskiyous and seeing the sign and thinking, if I could only be film critic of the Oregonian and write books. And the punchline is, if I knew they were actually taking requests at that moment, I would have put a dollar figure in there. Who knew that I was actually making wishes? But I've been very fortunate to come to a community, the greater Portland community, so the community once served by the Oregonians, still served by a news organization of that name, and the readers. It's not my thing, but it's a thing, and I'll tell you what, that new Oregonian looks nice in your hand. The color reproduction and the layout are a lot sharper and cleaner than they were in my day. FYI, make your own choices, but I've been living in Portland. This is a digression. I've been here 22 years. My children are 6th generation Oregonians. The first negative quality of life issue that's happened in my time here is the loss of a daily newspaper. The first negative thing that I have to say about this town in 22 years. I'm not sure y'all are born car drivers, but we can forget that. The first negative thing is losing a paper. And I want to talk a little bit about the newspaper business toward the end, because probably more of you have encountered and taken my name in vain in the context of the Oregonian than in the context of my books. as Kathy said, I've written biographies of various people in entertainment, or in the case of one fella, on the periphery of entertainment, and I've written pop culture histories. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I go about the process of selecting a subject, what sort of research I do, what the marshaling of the research and the writing is like, and just what that process is like from my side of the mirror. Biography is a strange thing. You wind up knowing a ton about someone whom you've never met. I've met some of the people I've written about. I never met Paul Newman. I just finished a book on Robert De Niro. I've not met Mr. De Niro. But I do have his complete urological history, which was the subject of a lawsuit once and was a matter of public record in the state of California. So like I say, you learn a lot about people who you've never met. I've written books about Jerry Lewis, Paul Newman, Robert De Niro. I've written a book about a figure from the 1950s, a fellow by the name of Porfirio Rubirosa, who was the archetypal Latin playboy. He married heiresses and actresses. He raced cars. He was a bagman for a dictator. He was a jewel thief, probably killed a couple of people. But just a fascinating guy. And I've written 2 books, 3 actually, one gets an asterisk, about cultural phenomena. One about the Rat Pack era of the 50s and 60s, Frank Sinatra and that lot, and the Kennedys and the mob in Vegas. And one about swinging London in the 1960s, mini skirts and electric guitars and pop art, and Vidal Sassoon, who I did get to meet and did get to interview. And in all of these cases, the trick was to find something that you could sell to a publisher. So if you want, you can make $1 on a book so long as someone else makes $1.10 on the book. If someone can publish your work, New York corporations I'm talking about, in a way that they see a return in, that they see, they're in it for literature, but the type of books I write are a product. They have a certain number of biographies each year, a certain number of histories each year. They have a pop culture list, then they have their serious fiction, then they have their genre fiction. You have to give them something they can fit into one of those slots and cut you off a piece of their budget. Fair enough. It's a business, manufacturing books, and the way you do that, you think about the things you're interested in, and every now and then you look it up. You go to Amazon, you go to the Library of Congress and see, is there a book on this subject? When was the last time someone wrote a biography of Paul Newman? I thought of writing a biography of Paul Newman back in 1992, when I was just beginning to write my first book, which wound up being about Jerry Lewis. I was proposing ideas, and a publisher was saying, no, we don't like that, but what do you think of this? And I was like, no, I don't like that, but hang on, give me a weekend, and I'll come back with some ideas. And one of the ideas I had was Paul Newman. And there had been 2 books published in 1989. I was like, well, 3 years later, I'm not going to write, no one's going to pay me to write a book about a guy that there's already a brand new book about, more or less, 2 of them. 20 odd years later, when I was, that would have been my first book, I think this would have been my 5th, I said to my agent, Paul Newman, no one's written a book about him since those books in the late 80s. And Paul Newman lived a very full life between 1989 and his death in 2008. So, there's still a lot of subject on this guy. And it was a saleable book. There was a hole in the bookshelf. And I could present to a publisher that filling that hole would sell stuff. Paul Newman, you put his face on a can of dog food and you can sell it, There isn't anything that company, it's a fascinating story. And by talking about it, I'll bring you up to the next point. Biography is a lot of words. The book I wrote about Jerry Lewis was 220,000 words, like 1,100 manuscript pages, some crazy thing like that. The book on De Niro that I just finished, the manuscript was like 800 pages. It'll be like 450 published. But it's a lot. You take on someone who's worthy of writing a book about. You may think that, say, a younger actor, Brad Pitt, Sean Penn, quality performers who make interesting movies all the time, Jodie Foster. You may think that people like this could support a book, but they don't have quite that span of life that I want to read about a life of. I want to read the life. In fact, the Newman book is called Paul Newman, A Life, and the publishers decided that worked so well they're going to call the new book De Niro, A Life. I love that because it's like so few letters. I could get a tattoo of it and it wouldn't hurt. But one of the things that you have to do, in addition to having a longevity, and as a storyteller, you kind of like to have a beginning, middle, and end. So it's if you have someone who has passed, you have your ending. I mean, we know how it's going to end. People write books about Lincoln every year. We all know how he goes. It's not a bad thing to have that ending. But if you think about it, every life has the beginning, middle, and end. And every life is a series of data points, things that were done, milestones reached, ages, losses, achievements. Everyone's got a chronology in their life. Technically, one damn thing after another. Just a list. And if you imagine, well, maybe your list includes making Cool Hand Luke. Maybe your list includes marrying Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton in the same lifetime. But it's just a thing you did. It's just one thing. And in a certain sense, it's not exceptional because we all fill our days and we all reach one end to the other. And I would think about this as a clothesline. The chronology of a life, when you're writing about it, is like a clothesline. It's connecting two posts. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, two walls in an apartment complex. But what makes the clothesline interesting is the stuff that's hanging from it, the stuff that draws your eye. So for instance, when I thought of Paul Newman in 1992, in that same session on the UCLA card catalog, because the Multnomah County card catalog wasn't online, and I was at a beach house near Warrenton. On dial-up, I had called UCLA. They also had every film book. I thought of Jerry Lewis. And right away, in my mind, 6 or 7 things about him popped up. 6 or 7 things that you could hang off that clothesline. Physical comedy, borscht belt humor, partnership with Dean Martin, legend in France, muscular dystrophy, the telethons, all the weird, angry, older incidents he's had, the movie King of Comedy with De Niro made by Marty Scorsese. So right away I could see not only was there a beginning, middle, and not an end. Jerry is still thriving. He just got his hands at Grauman's, or what used to be Grauman's Chinese Theater again. I think it's the 3rd time. But I knew that there were interesting things to say, and I knew that each of those pieces would sustain a chapter, or be a motif that kept coming back in the story, and give the reader either highlights in one spot or something that you always come back to. Paul Newman, you can talk about. He has a very surprising upbringing. At the time I thought of Paul Newman, I did not know he was the son of a very a comfortably middle-class Cleveland family who were all eccentrics and inventors. 2 of his uncles had patents, and the family business was the biggest sporting goods store in Cleveland, supposedly the biggest between New York and Chicago. Newman Brothers. You go to Cleveland and there's people of a certain age. I got my roller skates at Newman Brothers. Oh, Paul Newman's dad sold me all my fishing gear. Very common. Paul Newman was raised Jewish. But his mother converted to Christian Science. She was a Catholic immigrant from, I can never remember if it's Slovenia or Slovakia, but one of them. And I didn't know that about him. I didn't know that he had been in the Navy during the war. He seemed too young, but in fact he served 16 months at the end of the war, turned 18 in 1943. I didn't know he'd gone to Kenyon and to Yale. So, that became something that I hung off the clothesline, but I didn't know that about him at the start. At the start, I knew he's a businessman, he's a race car driver, he's a philanthropist, he's got this famous marriage, he's handsome as the devil, he made good movies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts. Not too many people you can say that about. I'm teaching a class at Portland State in American screen acting, Brando, Newman, and De Niro. And we've just watched in the last 2 weeks Somebody Up There Likes Me, 1956, Robert Wise, the biopic of Rocky Graziano, and 1963, HUD, Martin Ritt. And we don't think necessarily of Newman as being in the same league as Brando. You know, Brando's like Jimi Hendrix. But to see this guy, my students had never seen Paul Newman act. Maybe they'd seen Cool Hand Luke or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Slapshot. To see this guy do those two roles really impressed them. You know, so you have a guy of great talent, but his talent is only one of the things on the clothesline. I just finished writing about De Niro, and De Niro doesn't have much stuff on the clothesline. I had to handle this book differently. You know, he's a businessman, but he's not he's not an innovator in business. His most notable business achievements are he owns 27 Nobu sushi restaurants around the world, very, very high end. You can have dinner for $300 if you wish. The first one was built literally across the street from De Niro's home. He could stand in his penthouse and look down into the window and see the end of the bar. He's a homebody. He built a film center in New York City. It's on the same block as Nobu. So to go to his favorite restaurant and or his office, he had to cross one street that's not much wider than this room. He's a family man of a sort. He's got 9 children whom I can identify by 4 women whom I can identify. And 2 of them are children whose parentage has been disputed, but for whom he has at least at some point taken financial responsibility. The other 7 are still around him. And when you learn about Hollywood people, the ones whose families are still close like that are few and far between. So even though this guy has a very unconventional family, he had his 70th birthday recently, all his exes were there. You know, none of them needed to be frisked before they entered the room. You know, they get along. They get along. They know one another and they work it out. And God love them. You can't judge a man harshly who keeps it together even when he spreads his seeds so wide. So, I have a guy, Newman, who doesn't have a lot of stuff on his clothesline. How do you make an interesting book about it? Well, I have an idea. Once you've got the subject and you start doing research, and you do a little bona fides research, due diligence before you propose it. You don't want to propose it and find out that there is no stuff. So before you can propose to your editor and your agent, this is the project I'd like to do, you do your research. And in working on De Niro, I found that he had donated his about 40 years worth of professional materials to the University of Texas at Austin. Production files, business memos, scripts, storyboards, articles, transcripts, all sorts of stuff. It was hundreds of banker's boxes. And I went down to Texas and I spent, over the span of about 3 years, about 2.5 months, sitting in the library in Austin and then going out and eating barbecue to entertain myself at night. And I went through all the paper, all of it, because you never know. You never know what you're going to find. One of my great discoveries in working on Jerry Lewis, he had also made a similar donation, not as extensive, to USC. And there were ledgers of the films that he produced for Paramount Pictures. And I was so dogged, that was the positive word, dogged, about looking at everything, that I was looking through these ledgers And I saw that Jerry had handwritten on some pages, the returns in week 3 in Biloxi for the Nutty Professor had dropped, and he wanted to know why. Just incredible. Just incredible that the star of the movie should be going through this stuff that a bean counter would have fallen asleep over. Anyway, I'm going through this ledger, and it's giving me a sense of the man I'm dealing with when, lo, a love letter to Stella Stevens falls out. That was a clothesline item. The librarians at USC are like, I didn't know that was in there. I was like, how long has this book been in your 25 years the book has been sitting there, but no one bothered to turn the pages. And as far as they were concerned, that was scholarship. I had found, the missing link, the proof. As one of Jerry's sons said, did he sleep with anyone who wasn't named Stevens? But this gets me to this other theory. You're doing your research. You're trying to find out if there's enough out there to do a book, to do a proper book. And by proper book, I have one book in mind. I was an English student and comparative literature student. I have an MFA in poetry, and the greatest book of biography I've ever read was Richard Ellman's James Joyce, written, I think, in 54, 58, somewhere around there, and revised about 15 years later. And I read that book when I was an undergraduate, and I read it again in grad school, and it's a wonderful explication of Joyce, but it's also just such a compelling story about this eccentric fellow who, on the surface, doesn't have a lot of things on the clothesline. He had extraordinary access to the people involved and to the papers, including private correspondence among the Joyce family. So in my mind, I always want to write that book. Not even close. But anyhow, that sort of orientation, that sort of amassing of material, my idea there is you look up, you look down, you look left, you look right. What do I mean by that? Up, University of Texas, USC. Go to the places that have archives. Enter your subject's name in a database. Look around, read bibliographies. See where there's a critical mass of material on this subject. Call the librarian. Look up, right? I say up because academe, I've been to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic for a week. Never touched the water. I spent the entire week in the National Archives and the National Library of the Dominican Republic looking up stuff on Rubirosa. And I looked at everything in the National Archives that they had, and I said, this is it? The guy was a diplomat for like 30 years. And the guy says to me, no, that's not it. And they had been bringing me these packages of papers that were wrapped like in butcher paper with twine. And I would try and untie the knot, and it would just pulverize. It had not been touched in 75, 100 years. His father had been a diplomat, and some of his papers were there. I said, but there's so many gaps here. And the guy says, yeah, I know there are gaps. Come with me. And he takes me to a room 12 times the size of this room, and there is a mountain of these parcels. And he says, we don't know what's in any of those. So that, you look up, because you never know what you're going to see.
No water.
Yeah, but you look down, and by down, I'm writing about showbiz people. You show me a picture of them in the National Enquirer, I'm going to read that article. Because the very first book I wrote, Jerry Lewis was personally hostile to me and my project after we met a couple of times. He thought the biographer's function was to exalt the subject, not to tell the story of the subject. We disagreed on that, and we didn't have any sort of contract, so we parted ways. I had 6 hours of remarkable audio tape, but I also had a potential libel suit on my hand with everything I wrote. So when I wrote those 210,000 words, afterwards I spent 35 hours on a telephone with a libel lawyer at St. Martin's Press, going over every jot and tittle of that book. I sent the guy like a moving box filled with, this is 1995, so I couldn't scan it. I had to send him a big box filled with papers, documenting. And we wrote a book in which the worst things said about Jerry Lewis on page 1 through page 500 is in the mouth of Jerry Lewis. And I either have it on audio tape, or it was published by the New York Times or Playboy or Penthouse or the National Enquirer. And the reason I don't shun Playboy and Penthouse and the National Enquirer is because of the sorts of stories those places run, they are pretty good at sourcing their material. They may not say in the article who exactly their source is, but they have a source. These people almost never get sued. They write what they can prove. They gussy it up. They bang the drum, to play, they make it sound bigger than it is, but actually, now I'm not talking about every single supermarket tabloid. I'm talking about the National Enquirer, which Generoso Pope was the publisher originally and started Confidential magazine in the 50s. Confidential was a very sexy and salacious magazine that broke the gentleman's agreement in Hollywood and reported on what stars actually did. Confidential famously knew in the mid-50s that Rock Hudson was gay and was going to come out with the story, but MGM or Universal wanted Rock Hudson as a star, so they gave Confidential the story of Rory Calhoun, kind of a rough-hewn action star in the Steve McQueen mode in the 1950s. He had been imprisoned in Texas or Nebraska for vehicular homicide. So they gave him up to the Confidential to hide the story about Rock Hudson. When you know things like that about that business, then you tend to believe some of the tawdry sources, because maybe blackmail is their tool, but they could be sued anyhow if they publish it, if it's not true. So you look down. I was working on Paul Newman, and this was a sick-making day. I'll tell you what, it's no fun to tell the world that their hero has feet of clay. But then you say to the world, who doesn't? At any rate, I was working on Newman, and I was going through a folder of articles at the Motion Picture Academy Library. The people who put on the Oscars have a research library in Beverly Hills. And I see an article from Photo Play magazine, but from the late 60s, after the era when Photo Play was a big, when it was sort of like People was 10, 20 years ago, or maybe still today. And it was a story by a woman who claimed to have a long affair with Paul Newman in the late 60s. A woman, what's the famous quote that Paul Newman said about cheating on Joanne? Why should I go out for hamburger when I have steak at home, right? We've all heard that. No, I don't know if Mrs. Newman was ever on record about being compared to a slab of beef, but at any rate, it was a positive comparison. The mistress's name, the alleged mistress, was Nancy Bacon. Chalk that under the column, things you can't make up. And he was Jewish. It was true. It was true. I read this thing and I was like, there are details about Paul Newman in this article that it took me 3 years to learn. And I've been working on this daily. I knew what type of car he was driving at that time. I knew how it had been customized. I'd spoken to people who'd worked on it. She described it in this article. Anyone could say they were in Paul Newman's car. Not in print. Not against the biggest movie star in Hollywood in 1968, 69. She worked for 20th Century Fox. So many parts of her story checked out. And then I found that she'd written a memoir. Talk about going low. Her book was called, I swear to God, Stars in My Eyes, Stars in My Bed. And it's not a very becoming story. It's like a memoir. It's sort of like Cheryl Strayed's Wild, but instead of the Pacific Crest Trail, it's the Sunset Strip that she's making her way down. And she's married. She's from Gig Harbor, Washington, and she was married to one of the Ventures, the surf rock band who began in Tacoma. She went down to LA with those guys and she hung out, and she and her husband got into a crazy scene and they were divorced. It was the 60s, and she had relationships with Ben Gazzara and Dick Smothers and the young Edward James Olmos, and just unbelievable stuff. But this was published by Signet Books in New York City. So I know that this woman went through the process that I went through on King of Comedy. It may be tawdry, it may be cheap, it may be stuff you don't want to know, but it isn't libel. Because if a corporation in New York is publishing it and they don't wind up in court, then these things happened. It's not your proudest thing, and you have to know how to use that stuff. I tracked Nancy Bacon down. I got an independent confirmation of her story. And when I was interviewing her, I said, you know what's interesting about this? Not that you slept with Paul Newman for a few months, but that he and Joanne stayed together for 40 years after that. Now, people forget that Joanne was the second Mrs. Newman and that Paul was married with 3 kids when he met her. I think the statute of limitations on true love, 50 years marriage, wife number 1 has to say, I got to give it up. That was meant to be. 50 years. All right, they hang in 50 years. But, you know, the image that we have of the Newmans wasn't exactly the reality. And the question is, how do you mount it? How do you mount it? The story of Nancy Bacon in Paul Newman: A Life takes up about 750 words out of 170,000. That's about right, page and a half. Of course, when the book came out, that was the big screaming headline, you know, from people who hadn't read the book. New, shocking tell-all biography. Yeah, it is a tell-all biography. For instance, I told what he wrote on his application to Kenyon College, because when I drove down to Gambier, Ohio, they handed me his handwritten application from 1946. I read his father's letters to his uncle and his mother when his father was away on business trips. His uncle was a famous journalist, and his papers were collected at the Case Western Historical Society, and you could walk in there and read them. I read, looking up again, I found at Columbia University, some academic at Columbia in 1959 went to every theater on Broadway and did a lengthy interview with actors, directors, playwrights, people in the crew, and sort of like an oral history of Broadway, a snapshot in 1959, and there was a 160-page Q&A with Paul Newman. He was on Broadway with the original production of Sweet Bird of Youth by Tennessee Williams, Elia Kazan's last Broadway production. And Kazan's last movie was with De Niro, but I'm not going to write a book about Kazan. So you've gathered all this material. You look down, you look down, you look left, and you look right. Put them in the context of their times. Look left and look right. You know, what else is going on? Who are the other stars in Hollywood? Who is Newman competing for to get the part in Exodus before he's a superstar? Who do you have to beat out to get the part in Cat in the Hot Tin Roof before that? Or for that matter, to be in his second feature film, Somebody Up There Likes Me. That one was easy. James Dean was supposed to play that part. He was killed. Newman had just played a boxer on TV. He got the part. Newman talks about Newman's luck, crazy things. Shocking tell-all biography. Paul Newman was a tail gunner on a plane in the Pacific in 1944, and his squadron were set to fly to another aircraft carrier that day. They were being redeployed, and his pilot woke up that day with an ear infection, and they were grounded, and everyone else in the squadron left, and that second carrier got hit by the single worst kamikaze attack in the war. And Newman would have been there, except his pilot woke up with an ear infection. He called it Newman's luck. Having those blue eyes. That was a lucky bit. He had nothing to do with it. He was a little ashamed of that. The thing he was most famous for, and it just sort of happened. He wasn't even alive when it happened, technically. As the Supreme Court currently determines, he was not alive. Yeah, not here to talk about that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So, you have your material, you look left, you look right. Ruby Rosa was wanted by the New York District Attorney for 30 years on a murder case. We knew that Ruby came into the country. We knew that he met with his cousins. We knew that an enemy of the Trujillo government of the Dominican Republic was gunned down in his apartment in Harlem. We knew that Ruby Rosa had left. And we knew that the cousins left, and then the cousins disappeared. The DA wanted to learn about that, but Ruby became a diplomat, and he couldn't be touched for 30 years. And then Trujillo was assassinated, and the country was democratized. And Ruby lost. I do believe the first act of the Dominican government, the parliament, was to throw out all the diplomatic protections that Trujillo had handed out during his dictatorship. So technically, the first thing they did was strip this guy of his diplomatic immunity. And being a gentleman of the world, he had to buy some Dunhill suits or something. He came to New York and was staying at the Plaza Hotel, and he was immediately summoned to the district attorney's office. That file is lost. And he went downtown looking elegant, didn't answer questions in a very practiced way, and there was nothing they could do. This was a 30-year-old murder, and this was the first crack they had at this guy, and they didn't get him. And there were pictures of him in the paper, in the New York Daily News, the tabloid paper. And I was struck by one thing. The big headline in the Daily News that day was like sub-zero temperatures in New York City, and Ruby Rosa is getting in and out of a car wearing just a suit. He doesn't have a hat, he doesn't have an overcoat, no mittens, scarf. I thought, this is one cool customer. He's just going to show up like he's, in the first class lounge and leave. And only by reading that newspaper and seeing what else was going on in the news that day did I pick up that detail. So when I wrote about it, I said, it was a freezing cold day, the trains had stopped, and Ruby shows up at the DA's office in a limousine, not even wearing an overcoat. How's that for, I don't care, So you look left, you look right, you look up, you look down, you have your material. The most important thing to do with that material is know where to find it again. It took me years to develop filing systems, but if I were to take you to my office, I keep a little writing office in southeast Portland. I live in southwest. It's got no telephone and the computer has no modem. I put all my materials there and I work on books there, and then if I have to look something up, I make a note in a scratch pad and I look it up when I come home. Monkey brain. I'm terribly infected. I am born to tweet. I have to sometimes put the phone across the room so that I'm not tempted to turn my head down and talk about the experience instead of having it. But I file everything so that I can find it in a number of ways. If it's from the 70s, it's in a file on the 70s. If it has to do with their health, it's in a file on the health in the 70s. If there's a mention of, say, Meryl Streep in it, then it's in the Streep. It's like the same piece of paper will be there in 3 places, so that when I'm writing or when I'm about to prepare a chapter and I pull out the material pertinent to it, I will find it. I can't help but find it. There's more than one place where it is, and there's more than one way I can use it. I can use it when I'm talking about his health. I can use it when I'm talking about his money, his family, things. Sometimes you collect them all in one place, odd little things. Someone gets to be Newman's age, De Niro's age, they win a lot of, they're presented with a lot of honorary diplomas and nice awards. It's better to just put that all in one paragraph. In the span of the next 15 years, he would win the A, B, C, D, E, F, and G award. I'm not talking about Oscars and Nobel Prizes. I'm talking about like Italian American Man of the Year. This sort of thing. They're nice and they're notable, but they're not really interesting on the clothesline. But you put them all in one place so that 200 years from now, someone will care and someone will find it. And there it is. That's the job of the biographer. Put it all in place and make it logical for them to find, and pray that you have a good indexer. You don't index your own books. I'd kill myself. By the time I have to read this book twice more, I have to read it. The copy editor is working on it, and then I'll see proofs and or galleys. And then I probably will never look at it again. I've read one of my books since it was published. I said I had a book that gets an asterisk of pop culture history. I wrote a second book on the Rat Pack. In 2010, I was hired by an English art dealer who specialized in rare movie posters. You'd go into his shop and you'd see like an original Italian poster of Touch of Evil in perfect condition, beautifully framed for like 15,000 pounds. But it's a work of art, it's not just, advertisement. And he was looking for posters, and he discovered a photo archive in Los Angeles where a couple dozen photographers who used to work very closely with the Rat Pack had all of their original negatives and unpublished pictures. And it would be things like, if you think of a classic image of the Rat Pack, say the five guys standing in front of the Sands Hotel, it would be all the other shots from that session. Other people standing around with them, or they're getting ready, or they're not quite in the costume that we're used to seeing. Really remarkable stuff, and stuff you never saw before. Peter Lawford's Beach House, and it's Peter Lawford, Patricia Kennedy Lawford, Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Sammy Davis Jr.'s wife, and someone has just bought a you can tell by the pictures when you look at them all in sequence. There's a box on the table, magnifying glass, Polaroid, and they're all looking at a Polaroid picture. Like someone is photographing them, discovering a Polaroid picture. They'd never seen that before. Just a remarkable thing. Anyway, this guy hired me to do this book. Retails for $650. It comes in a wooden box with a gelatin print of one of the pictures inside. It's just mind-blowing. It's obviously not for me. But he hired me to write text for every chapter and to do captions. And I delayed, and then finally there was a deadline. I was like, oh my God, I've done no research for this. Oh wait, I'm going to read Rat Pack Confidential, my book. So it's the only time I've read a book of mine, and it was research. And it wasn't so bad. I still get royalties on that book. That's every time I tell my agent, hey, I got another royalty check, he says, that's because I didn't get you enough up front. The agent, they should pack the truck to your house before you write the book. That's how the agent's mind works. And frankly, that's why he and I get along. Because I have that same feeling, pay me now and I'll write the book. I sell one book and then I write it. It's up to them to sell books. And I'll do whatever I can to help them. But in the end, I don't know how to do that. I know how to write them. So I'll sell you one. Right now, I'm working on a proposal. Today, I spent most of the day. It's a book tentatively titled Dolce Vita Confidential. It's set in the 50s and early 60s in Rome. And sports cars and Ferrari, Fellini and paparazzi and the making of Cleopatra. And there's a couple of society murders and scandals, real juicy stuff. Via Veneto and the Via Margutta, the Greenwich Village of Rome.
So you get to go to Rome to do the research.
I have to. No way around it. That said, for Newman, I went to New York, L.A., and Cleveland. So life owes me Rome. But you assemble all this stuff so you can find it again later. Because, doing the research is obviously very important. This Newman, the De Niro book, I did not get to speak to as many people as I would have wished. He did not wish to participate in the book. That's okay. Neither does Napoleon, and they write books about him all the time. But he had this archive. And in this archive, I was able to show how he built his work, because this is the thing that makes him famous, right? Not the fact that he had all these children or owns restaurants. Back to the 1960s, I found in the De Niro papers a letter that he wrote to the Daily Tar Heel at the University of North Carolina in 1966. De Niro was in dinner theater in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the Daily Tar Heel published a review of his performance. And he was writing to ask for copies of the review and sending along $1 to cover the papers and postage. And there's two things there. First of all, oh my God, this letter and these reviews. The second thing is, he kept this? That tells me more about De Niro than anything anyone who worked with him on The Untouchables would tell me. By then, he's famous. There's a wonderful quote, there's a great book about the Beatles called Revolution in the Head that tells the story of their life and times through their songs. So the guy goes song by song, but he's always looking at biographical things about them at that moment. And he says in his introduction that the Beatles went up to Pop Heaven and pulled the ladder up behind them. And I think they all do that. When you become famous, at a certain point, you're up there. And everyone who's up there has the same privileges as you. And one of the things upon which those privileges rely is your discretion. Tom Hanks is not going to tell you anything about Paul Newman other than he was a great guy. So at a certain point, there's no point in talking to Tom Hanks about Paul Newman, even though they worked together, But if you can find the guy who knew Newman at Yale or in the Navy before he was famous, when he was one of the gang, then you learn about the guy. He isn't being catered to at that point in his life. He's not who he's going to be. He's who he's becoming. And if you can't get interviews, then treat the guy like a historical subject. Treat him like a historical subject. Read every interview he ever gave. I started this on Newman, and I kept it up on De Niro. I found every interview possible in English forever. Back to 1971 in the case of De Niro with Newman, I found, I can't even remember how I stumbled across this, but in the Daily News, the tabloid newspaper in New York City, they used to have the inquiring photographer who'd go out on the street every day and ask a question of 5 people and take their picture. And there was Paul Newman of Staten Island. He was moved down from New Haven to see if he could get jobs on Broadway or in live television. And the question was like about husbands disciplining their wives, and young Paul was in favor of that. I can't remember the exact quote, but yeah, it's these are barbarous times. I'm telling you, he had feet of clay. He was just like everyone else. But you treat them like a piece of history, and you find things. You treat them like you document things. In the case of De Niro, I found correspondence between Elia Kazan and De Niro about the character he plays in The Last Tycoon, 40 pages of letters. I found a transcript of 60 to 100 pages. De Niro and Michael Mann, the director of Heat, had a long conversation about De Niro's character, and they tape recorded it and had someone transcribe it, and they each got a copy. And you could see what they were trying to do because they're saying it. It's in their words. I found letters. Meryl Streep thanking De Niro for letting her and her daughters, their heater was broken at their place. And De Niro always had multiple apartments in New York, so he lent them his 14th Street place. And she's thanking him and said, she was very worried about the baby, but, everything was okay. Amazing. Again, tells you about the guy. So you have all this material, and you treat the person you're telling the story. You're trying to be Richard Ellman. You're trying to tell the story of a life. My God, you've went to all this trouble. Why should I know about this guy? Make the case. Make the case that this is an emblematic life in the case of Paul Newman or Ruby Rosa, for that matter. Make the case that, the guy's deeper than you think in De Niro's case, that he's making decisions. I can even see the day he stopped making decisions about his acting, The script of The Last Tycoon, 1977, there are more words in De Niro's crabbed handwriting on every page of that script than there are in typewriting. And by 2004, 2005, on Meet the Parents 16 or whatever it was, there's one dog-eared page, and I was so excited, and I whipped to it, and he's made a circle and says, "What color my shirt?" Bobby. There are reasons for this. He produced those movies. The Parents, the Meet the Fockers movies, he produced 3 of them. You know what they've grossed worldwide? $1.3 billion theatrically. And he's a $1 participant. I ask you, if you can remember once being 60, how hard would you work after that? But he works. 2013 was his busiest year. He was in 7 feature films that played in American theaters. I wouldn't roll over in bed if they were showing it on that wall to see all but one of them. I had to. This is what you get paid for. But, I think he just likes to work. Either that or those 9 kids drive him up a tree. He's got a 3-year-old. And mom is 58, I never quite got the details of that story, so I just let it be. I pointed out that she's named for both of her grandmothers and let it go at that. That's their business. Let the next biographer sweep that mess up. You have all your material. You're starting to write your narrative. One of the great breakthroughs I had as a writer was the discipline to realize that I didn't have to start on page 1 and end on page X. I could write in any order I bloody well pleased, so long as I had enough time to stitch it all back together into the proper order and sand down the edges and fill in the gaps. I wrote King of Comedy, the biography of Jerry Lewis in chronological order. The next book I wrote, Rat Pack Confidential, I made a list, a huge list, like on a piece of the big newsprint pads that they sell at an art store. Always comes back to newsprint. And I just knew some of these things were going to take me 5 minutes to write, and some of them were going to take me 5 days. And I had a deadline, and I knew that, okay, I'm going to finish writing all of these pieces, cross everything off this list by May 1, and by June 1, I'll have edited it all together. And some days I would feel filled with vim and, stubbornness, and I would take on one of those hard ones, and I would spend a couple, 2, 3, 5 days until I got it done. And some days I woke up feeling like I couldn't hurt a mouse, and I would just do one of the short ones, cross it off the list, and then put it all together. And it's very liberating when you realize that you don't have to write in chronological order. I think it might be different for novelists. Biographies tend to be easier to write in chronological order, but you can leave a big chunk that says, Mother's Family History TK to come. And you can get to that after you've written about the 20 aughts. Doesn't make a difference. So long as it's in the right place when the thing is published, you're good. It's a very liberating thing to learn. They should tell you stuff like that. If you become a writer, it's like, hey, you don't have to start on page 1. Just get it all written down and then just put it all together. And how do you do that? You take your modem out of your computer. You sit in front of a chair. You sit on a chair in front of your writing device, whether it's a legal pad or a typewriter or a computer or a laptop or one of these screens you can now write on, and you sit in the chair, and you sit in the chair, and you sit in the chair. At a certain point, you figure out how long it's taking you to get through each piece you're writing. You say, son of a gun, this is going to take me another 8 months. And sometimes you look at it and you say, wow, I'm flying here. I can play hooky tomorrow. Some days you write 30 pages. Some days you write 3. Just so long as you go in there and do something and keep the ball moving even just a little bit, at the end, if you have to write 150,000 words, which is a large but not massive book, you're going to need 3 or 4 days where you knock out like 15 to 30 pages. I mean, a couple of those just like these days where, the hole is this big and none of your putts misses, You're just in the zone. And there's going to be probably 10 times that many days where getting to 4 or 5 pages is, God, that took some doing. And there's going to be a couple of days where you're just pulling dental floss out of a concrete wall and you're just lucky to get anything. But it evens out. It evens out. If you're neurotic about it, you're going to make it harder. It evens out. So long as you start in enough time, and so long as you've got the material. For me, half the fun of writing these books is learning about these things. I'm about to learn about Formula One racing in the 50s. I love that, the era of the gentleman race car driver, 1957, Enzo Ferrari introduces a new car that's going to be the fastest Formula One car that Ferrari has ever put their name on. And he's only going to let 5 guys drive it, 2 Italians, 2 Englishmen, and a Spanish count. Within 3 years, all 5 of those guys died behind the wheel of a car. There's a chapter. I mean, I can't wait to explore that. It sounds like Bloodlust, but it's exciting. It's a movie. Today I was editing this passage on Italian post-war fashion, and I was able to find the adjectives very readily to describe the Italian men's suit of the post-war era. Because in many ways that cut is still fashionable. Never has gone out of style. There's been variations on it. Lapels have gotten wider, but that cut that the Italians came up with after the war is probably the most influential men's suit look of the 20th century. But I realized I didn't have the adjectives for the women's clothes. I couldn't differentiate them from the French in my mind, or from New York in my mind. I knew the names of some of the designers who came up in the 50s. Valentino Emilio Pucci, who went to Reed. He was also a count. And he helped, he had something to do with like skiing and mountain climbing on Mount Hood. Like there was an article on him recently that I filed away and I've got it. But he has a noteworthy contribution to recreational sport on Mount Hood. He grew up, he was a rich man's son. He skied in the Italian Alps, and when he came to read, he was like, "Look at that mountain, let's go."
On Timberline, there is the Poochie Lift.
Ah, there you go. Yeah. He's a notable contributor to Northwest culture. I'll tell you a secret. Oregon is in every one of my books. I got it into the book about swinging London. I got it into the book about Ruby Rosa. Ruby Rosa's girlfriend for several years and 2 marriages was Zsa Zsa Gabor. I spoke to a guy who outfit them for a costume party, and they went as toreadors. And the guy said when he fit Zsa Zsa Gabor for the traje de luces, the bullfighter's costume, she was so gorgeous he almost fainted. I love that. But Zsa Zsa dallied for a while with the son of the Dominican dictator when he was at military college in Kansas. And he was showering her with gifts like furs and Mercedes-Benzes and Kim Novak also. And he was denounced in Congress because we were giving aid to this country, this poor, impoverished Caribbean country, and the son of the dictator is buying, cars for movie stars. I mean, Kim Novak was a movie star. Zsa Zsa Gabor was, like a Kardashian. And a congressman from McMinnville denounced her on the floor of the House. I want to. I'm not going to remember his name tonight, but he was alive actually when I was writing the book, and I made contact with his household, and I was told he can't help you with that. He was in Congress in the 50s. I wrote this book 10 years ago. But yeah, he called her modern day Madame Pompadour. So I worked Oregon into that book. Remains to be seen how I'm going to get to Rome. Oh wait, Poochie, Reed College, there, done. Next. Dean Martin's in every book as well. But he made his first post-Martin and Lewis movie was the huge flop, 10,000 Bedrooms, starring Dean Martin and Anna Maria Alberghetti. So you see, I'm already looking up and down. I find someone in the Reed College Alumni Magazine an article about Marchese Pucci, and then Dean Martin in 10,000 Bedrooms. That's the sublime to the ridiculous. I do want to say something about newspapering. All of the books I've written up until now, I wrote while I was employed in some capacity or the other by the Oregonian. I started freelancing for the paper in 1992 when I first moved here. Was given increasing duties. In 1997, I was hired and I stayed for 15 years. And I left in 2012 when, a number of things. The news business has changed. What's expected of you as a writer has changed. The remuneration has changed. Everyone whose byline you see in the Oregonian, whose name you recognize, Grant Butler, David Saracen, Maxine Bernstein, the old-timers, Jeff Mapes, Tom Holman, they're making much less money than they used to. Why is that? Why would these people have been around for a while? They got the same hair as me. Why are they doing it? And newspapering is a public service. That's why they're doing it, because it's like teaching school or putting out fires. They made the freedom of the press the First Amendment. Why do you think that was? That's an interesting thing to think about. You lose a newspaper. You lose the funny pages. I've learned how to RSS, Zitz, and Doonesbury. And if I have one beef with the new Oregonian layout, it's that Ziggy and the Family Circus are right next to each other like twin barrels of a shotgun. You accidentally read one, and then you've accidentally read two, and it doesn't matter what happens the rest of the day. You're polluted. Sorry. The little round, awful comics. They're right next to each other. On the one hand, that's perfect. On the other hand, put them back with the classifieds, with the used birds. There's still quite a few ads for pets in the paper. But you lose that. You lose the movie ads every day. The single most pressing issue that faced the film goers who read the Oregonian during my tenure was when the display advertising for movie theaters with the daily timetable disappeared. I just changed my voicemail message saying, if this is what you're calling about, here's the number for Regal Cinemas. They're in Knoxville, Tennessee. They made this decision, and namaste, good luck to you dealing with them. But so you lose some of that utility, some of that entertainment value, but you lose stuff that has nothing to do with my work. You lose people showing up at public meetings, going over public records. Even now, the paper still takes this seriously in this small format, in this hobbled frequency. Even now, they still have an investigative journalism team. They won a Pulitzer Prize on the editorial board for their work on explaining and doing research on PERS based on explanatory and investigative journalism. They take that stuff seriously. The things that they've won the Pulitzers for, writing about economic issues, writing about immigration issues, writing about meth, who else is going to do that? God love the TV news. I do TV news now. These people don't do that. They don't do that. They ask the hard questions. They knock on a door and ambush some guy who's like, he's there, filling water jugs. And they're like, how come your company did this? I don't know. You're going to have to talk to the boss. Well, the boss wouldn't talk to us, but we'll keep asking the hard questions. Yeah, when you get an answer, write it up. I've had the experience driving to work, listening to OPB, hearing my copy read over the radio as news. I've seen people practically sitting on camera reading from the newspaper. Even in its diminished form, its hobbled form, it's still the largest news organization in the region. Seattle had 2 newspapers for a time, but that was a chimera because they were owned by the same person. They published a joint edition on Sunday. Hello, what was that? Kumbaya? They had the same owners. And the Oregonian was bigger at any given moment than either of those Seattle newspapers, and they got cut to one. And then because of their ownership, they were cut, the Oregonian being privately held on to its staff much longer than publicly held newspapers. If you were in a town serviced by Tribune or Knight Ridder, Scripps, any of those companies, your paper got to this size, not this frequency. The frequency thing still sticks in my craw, the half-agonian. It's tough. I do believe that the people who show up every day to do that work are just as critical to their community as firemen and teachers, policemen. I mean, they are public servants. They work long hours. There is zero glamour in what they do. They get told no, and they get called names, and they get threatened anonymously all the time. I got hassled because I disagreed with someone about a movie. Imagine if I was writing about their pension, something that actually mattered. Imagine the sort of mail you get if your picture is in the paper and you're talking about things like marriage equality or racial bias or economic disparity, things that are contentious in our society. Imagine what you hear from people. The salary you get, do you honestly think, does anyone besides me and you guys know anyone who works at a newspaper? Because they get paid about what a teacher makes. $50,000 to work at a newspaper, you're sitting pretty. This is not, there's star people at the paper who get more, but most people get a working wage. And people would say, would you want to work at the New York Times? I said, are they paying $1 million a year? You have to live in New York on a journalist's salary? Are you nuts? I don't know how people do that. So I'm very sad to see the Oregonian take it on the chin, to see any newspaper. I grew up in New York City. I got the New York Times and Daily News every morning. The afternoon paper when we lived on Long Island was Newsday, which was a really fine paper. We got the Nassau Herald and the South Shore Record, the weekly newspapers from our community. My dad would come home every week with the Village Voice on a Wednesday when he took the train home. So I grew up in newspapers, reading newspapers, looking at, reading bylines, being able to tell which sports writer I liked and didn't, who disagreed with me about the Mets. Angry at the guy, just like people would get angry at me. You have a relationship with someone and all you know about them is the letters of their name. There's nothing like that today. I've blogged for years. I was the second person in the Oregonian newsroom who was given the keys to his own blog. John Canzano had one before me. And I blogged until I burnt out on blogging. It always seemed to be the second part of my job. And I love it. I've been online since the early 80s, and I have more email addresses than fingers. I'm very, very comfortable in the online space, but it's not the same. It's not the same. And I can tell you that if you've written about someone or you've written about a movie and you tell them, hey, it's in tomorrow's paper, they're like, great, is there a picture? If you tell them it's online, they're like, oh, is there any chance you can run it in the print? You know, it's kind of like a running joke in the newsroom that, you know, people say, oh, I don't need the newspaper. Is that in the newspaper? Oh, wow, that's nice. Can I get copies of that? No one says, can I get extra copies of that blog post? You know, people don't print things they read on blogs and like file them away and share them. They send you a link. You look at it or you don't. The great online, instead of did you read this, it's TLDR. Too long, didn't read. That's like 3 paragraphs. TLDR, whatever. I saw the headline. You got your click. It's not the same thing. So I miss it. On the other hand, I got my wish. I got to work at a newspaper in a town where people read the paper, in a town where people went to the movies. You know what? Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon. You cannot say this about any other city in the United States of more than 1 million inhabitants or even, 250,000 inhabitants. If you draw a line from City Hall to the Hollywood Theater, make a circle with that as the radius, there are more screens inside that circle, inside the core of Portland, dedicated to alternative, independent, documentary, foreign, experimental cinema than there are to Hollywood films. It's unbelievable. To get to write for that audience, an audience that could take a movie like The Secret of Ronin-ish and keep it on Hawthorne Boulevard for a year? You know? Are you kidding? There was an independent film about 10 years ago called The Puffy Chair. It was a first film by these 2 brothers from Austin. I loved it. And I kept recommending it to people, and they made 5 times their budget. 5 times their budget in Portland, Oregon. Portland audiences will pick up on something, and it's not only in film, but I know film best. They'll pick up on something and they'll turn it into a hit. And to be able to write to that audience, I can't tell them don't go see Spider-Man 2, but don't go see Spider-Man 2. My God. Woof, woof, woof. You know for a fact, you can look it up, that certain things were done for contractual obligation reasons, but my God, can't they try to hide it? Can't they pretend that, anyone wanted to show up for anything other than give me my money? Just smile, You can steer people away from that, but here's the interesting datum about Portland moviegoing. When it comes to things like Spider-Man 2, Gravity, which I thought was a terrific movie, big budget movies, we are about the 22nd, 24th market in the United States, and we land on about 22nd, 24th on most of these mainstream releases. When it comes to specialty films, foreign films, independent films, documentaries, we jump to about 11th. Congrats to you. That's not me. I don't buy tickets to the movies.
Are we higher based on population? I mean, 1 million isn't that huge of a city. To be 11th.
No, we're jumping over. I mean, we're 22nd or 24th size city, and when it comes to those sort of films, we rank 11th.
Wow.
And this is behind, Chicago, San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, places where they make movies. Toronto gets included in that because it's part of the North American box office. It's
Vancouver, DC.
BC. Maybe. I don't know about Vancouver. It's a movie-making town. Portland is not a movie-making town. God bless. We're getting good at TV. But I wish I had a hair on my head for every conversation I had about how to make Portland a great movie-going town and what can the Oregonian do to help. It's like, report when you do something? How about that? We're a newspaper, not a PR firm, But I would be willing to help. We've never gotten around to making movies. Gus Van Sant makes movies here, he lives here, but when he makes movies in Portland, the budget is $200,000 and the cast is high school kids. Todd Haynes lives here. He has never shot a frame of film here. He's produced 4 films here. I don't think the 4 budgets together could buy a new fire truck. There was a period when people were making movies here. Warner Brothers made about 6 movies here in the 90s, but then they stopped. We're competing with the Canadian dollar. We're competing with Canada. Vancouver, BC has the film cruise. They have a 4 seasons. Bobby De Niro doesn't know what movie he's making tomorrow, but he knows he's going to wake up in a 4 seasons.
Well, I'm hesitating to say this. I was walking through the room, so I didn't hear the front, didn't hear the end. On the radio, on cable, they were interviewing 3 individuals, developers just yesterday, regarding that there is a very large movie group that wants to buy some building in Portland, and they have every stage that will work every large area except something about
A sound stage,
yeah.
which is
And one was a British fellow, and then the other 2 were, are Americans. And so they were so serious about it. Apparently they've got a huge amount of money through some grant, but I didn't hear what the building.
yeah. I honestly, I would not give those guys a nickel of my money.
I thought they were talking about Memorial Coliseum because that's all.
No.
up and down.
It's a bowl in a box. It's sacred. Yeah, I mean, people. No, people have been trying. I came here in 1992. One of the first meetings I had was with David Wilson, formerly of the Oregon Film Office. And they were going to do it then. It was the Silicon Forest meets Hollywood meets... the nearest thing we have to proper sound stages is Leica, behind a berm in Tualatin. Doing animation, doing world-class animation, some of the best animation you can see in the feature films and, smaller films. But we just haven't got it. I spent a lot of time in Austin while I was working on De Niro, and Austin is a town smaller than Portland, and it's a state capital and a university town, so it's artificially inflated, and it's still, Portland-sized more or less, but considering it has U of O and Salem in it, it's not bigger than Portland, It's filled with Fortune 500 companies, Dell, Whole Foods, oil people, energy people, high tech. So it's wealthier than Portland. And it's got an independent film scene. But it's all small budget filmmaking, horror films, genre films, indies, true indies, the sort of films that'll play at Sundance. And they've got the filmmakers, more filmmakers than we have, and they've got capital, and they've got the vibe. It's a creative town, and they don't do it. You need capital. You could build sound stages, but if Paramount Pictures doesn't want to come here to make a movie because they can go, 1.5 hour in the plane, they're in British Columbia, and they're saving 30% on wages, on rentals, on hotel rooms.
But wouldn't it be less expensive to do the sound stage here in Portland than in Austin, as you're using as a comparison? I mean, that's a...
Well, I'm saying that Austin has...
All the money is there, period. There's some grant that these people had yesterday. They were talking that they had a fair amount of money.
I hope it happens, but I'm not giving them a nickel.
You know, get a report of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's been talked about for a great deal of time. The one positive thing that the positive trend I can point to in this conversation is that Grimm and Leverage and Portlandia filming here at the same time, 3 TV series, means that we now have multiple people who live in town who have top level experience making these sorts of projects. There was a long time, the 20 years that I covered film and went to film sets, you would see the same guys working the electricity, doing the greenskeeping, doing the hair and makeup, the same people, because that was the best Portland crew. So when Richard Donner came here to make Assassins with Antonio Banderas and Sylvester Stallone, a masterpiece in no one's mind. The Free Willy people in Astoria, they had the best Portland crew. Now, Portland has 2 or 3 quality crews, which means that we can support more than one project, and the other thing that comes out of that, which I think is very positive, is that we don't know which of those people the greenskeeper, the kid telling the traffic that they have to go around because the film is being done. One of those could be the next Gus Van Sant. Because when Gus was just back home from Rhode Island School of Design, he worked as a sound man on independent films. He wasn't directing from the get-go. He was working. And there has to be work for a guy like that to get the experience to be able to make even a film like Mala Noche, his debut. So I want to bring this back to the Oregonian, then I'll take a couple of questions. But that is one of the things that the Oregonian, if there was ever a serious side to my work, it was encouraging the film industry in Portland, encouraging people in Portland. After I was there for a while, I was like, this movie will play in Portland for months. I would go to Sundance and see tiny American movies. What was that one called? Get Low with Robert Duvall. He's dying and he hires Bill Murray, he's the lawyer / undertaker. And the guy from the Hollywood Theater was at that same screening at Sundance. And when the movie was over, I said, Richard, that movie is going to play matinees at your theater for about 6 months. And sure enough, there are certain things, you look at them and it's like, that's Portland. And I had the bell and the bullhorn and I could say, hey, Portland, here's one of your movies. And God bless, people attended. So, there is a serious side to it, a business side. But I worked in the fun factory. The things that we lose when we lose a newspaper are a lot more important than movie reviews. So, I don't know if there's a call to action at the end of that. I can't encourage anyone to buy a subscription to a newspaper if they don't want to read it. But I'm telling you, it looks better than it did back in my day. There's a picture of this home from Gold Beach on the business page last week that's selling there's a $16 million home selling in Oregon, the highest, most expensive private home ever put on the market in Oregon. And there were pictures of it on the cover of the business section, and they were pretty. They looked like Golf Digest. I mean, not quite that type of paper, but it was nice. And I was like, dang, I've looked at color reproduction on past issues of the Oregonian, and I thought I needed 3D red and blue glasses because the color was so badly processed. I was like, there must be some way to rationalize this. Maybe if I look at it through a crystal, it'll look like the proper colors. Anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for sparing a warm night. I'd be happy to take a couple more questions.
Yeah, I assume when you're Paul Newman, you're going to go back and watch most of the movies by these guys?
Yeah.
So, do you have favorites?
Oh, heck yes. Jerry Lewis, I was not a fan of. I knew Jerry Lewis plays a clumsy bellboy at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami in 1960. So it's very chic, modern style with this clumsy guy. And then he did one called The Errand Boy, based at the same character but working in a movie studio. And then he did The Ladies' Man, which was a very interesting movie, where he was basically the houseboy in a home for single women. Like young women would move to the big city and live in a supervised house where they had apartments. And Jerry built on a soundstage at Paramount an entire house with one wall cut away. And every room could be lit at the same time. So you saw this cross-section of the house, and he could move the camera in and out and show all his misadventures, like he's dropping the laundry or, spilling water on George Raft's hat or something. So I came to like him, Newman. The weekend that he died, I felt an urge to see him act. And I watched 2 films that weekend that really, for me, particularly represented late Newman so well. One is Slapshot, which is a hilarious movie, the hockey film he made in 1977. He's 52 years old. He's skating around with these kids. He's having the time of his life. He's swearing. He's drinking. He has scenes where he's in his BVDs with his skinny legs, and he's getting a laugh out of it. And it's a great movie because it's like almost about nothing. It's like there's no big stakes. It's not Rocky. It's not Field of Dreams. It's like there's minor league hockey with a minor league mentality, and they go through all this, and when it's over, they really haven't learned much. That's kind of charming. And the other thing I watched was his 2003 Broadway performance that aired on PBS as the stage manager in Our Town. That was Paul's idea for the Westport Playhouse to put on Our Town after 9/11. and they brought the production to Broadway. And when Newman was breaking into TV, live TV and movies in 1956 or 54, he was in a live production on TV of Our Town. He played George Gibbs, the boy who marries the girl, and the stage manager was played by Frank Sinatra. And the song Love and Marriage was written for that telecast. Love and Marriage. So Newman had a history with this thing. So I was fascinated with that. With De Niro, it's the movies I grew up on. I was 13 when I saw Taxi Driver, and that just did it for me. I'm very fond of, his many of his Scorsese films. I like The Untouchables. What would I say that I rediscovered? A lot of the movies that I rewatched went down in my estimation. At the time that he made them, I was still sufficiently young and under his sway that I was biased toward them before I'd seen them. The one that repulsed me when I first saw it, that I think is incredible today, is Cape Fear. 1992. He's about 50. He's in better shape than he was when he played Jake LaMotta as a boxer 12 years earlier, and he's horrifying. And when I saw the amount of work he put in, he had these big artist folios, these leather zippered folios, about this thick of possible tattoo designs. That guy was covered with jailhouse tattoos. Robert Mitchum, who played that character in the original, plays the cop. And when Max Cady De Niro takes off his shirt, Mitchum says, "Geez, I don't know whether to book him or read him." So that came to me. And then, desperate to try and find late De Niro that I liked, there were a few films in the past few years. A small film called Stone, where he plays a parole officer, with Edward Norton and Mila Jovovich. A film called Being Flynn, where he plays a homeless, perhaps psychotic father to a writer, played by Paul Dano. And Silver Linings Playbook and American Hustle, the two films he made with David O. Russell. So there's no good Rat Pack movies. If those guys showed up, they had a great time, but they didn't make any good movies together.
Did I understand correctly that you got an MFA in poetry?
Yes.
Are you still writing
No.
poetry?
No. I wrote some poems in 2010 when I was on walkabout in South America and sitting in cafes, and I thought, this is perfect. I'm going to write a poem. And I tried to write a few sonnets because that's like doing a crossword puzzle. Hey, consider this, ye who mock Twitter. 140 syllables in a sonnet, 14 10-syllable lines, 140 characters in a tweet. I'm just saying. And I wound up writing 2 poems about the World Cup because the World Cup was on. I'm a soccer fiend.
About what age did you know that you had such an investigative mind?
That's a good question. It dawns on me that at a certain point in middle school or high school, someone taught me how to write a research paper, and I'm still doing that. I'm instead of writing things on index cards, then laying the index cards out and making an outline with index cards, I'm doing it with files and, with more subjects. But at a certain way, I've walked 2 kids through it, and I have another child just about to start high school, and everyone in the house can write. I think it's because the things I learned how to do at their age, so it's easy to tell them what I'm doing.
You have such a bliss about your whole description of everything, so it's
I'm fortunate. I get to do what I want to do.
yeah, it's great.
I appreciate your work, Liz. I pick up on your passion for what you call newspapering.
Yes.
And you said, is there a call to action for us? I issue perhaps a call to action to you, which is, might there come a time when you will write a story, a biography about the life of a newspaper?
Boy,
Oregonian.
Oh, no, I couldn't write that story.
No?
No.
Why not?
Too many personal connections. I have an idea for a memoir about Portland in the aughts and teens. I do not-for-profit work with a spin-off of the Timbers Army. I've been in the Timbers Army at Portland Timbers soccer matches since the Timbers Army was this big. And we have a 501c7 called the 107ist, 107 Independent Supporters Trust. We started in Section 107 of the stadium. And that organization, in 4 years in MLS, has given away more than $300,000 in charitable contributions and logged about 30,000 volunteer hours. And I serve on the board of a 501c3 that the 107ist gave seed money to, called Operation Pitch Invasion. And we repair soccer fields in the parks and schools, and we're just finishing, actually we're under construction. We finished fundraising for a $200,000 capital project at New Columbia in North Portland, which is the most diverse census tract in Oregon. There's 1,200 kids from 22 countries there. And there was an empty lot next to a Boys and Girls Club, and we're putting a turf field in. We're going to have a ribbon cutting in June. So my Oregon story is going to be how we did this. When the Timbers Army was this big, we had a journalist, a lobbyist, an attorney, the beer delivery guy. You need him, get a deal on a keg. We had everything we needed. And the story of how we got to where we are, I'm a baseball fan. I was in the stadium, I swear on my children, in 1969, the day the Mets won Game 5 against the Orioles. And 8 years later, I was in the stadium, I swear on my children, the night Reggie Jackson hit 3 home runs against the Dodgers in 3 at-bats. So I've seen the World Series won by my hometown team twice, but I didn't want the Beavers in that stadium. They had 150 season ticket holders. It was a football stadium. The first game of soccer was played on that field behind the Multnomah Athletic Club in 1894, as reported in the Oregonian. The first baseball game wasn't played there until the 1950s. I wanted them to turn Memorial Coliseum into Memorial Baseball Stadium, have a 15,000-seat baseball stadium, perfect for summertime baseball, right downtown on the Max line, on the freeway, on 2 freeways. But crazy things happened. The mayor was in a gay underage sex scandal. The guy who wanted to develop the deal, it was the worst economy in 60 years, and many people in Oregon, for good reason, personally blamed his father. We didn't get everything we wanted, but we got our team, we got our soccer team, and we turned around and we did what we said we'd do. We supported Portland. We're building this field. It's named Bless Field, named after Howie Bless, who was a founding member of the Timbers Army. He passed in 2009. He was in the council chamber. I was sitting beside him the day Dan Saltzman cast the deciding vote to build the stadium. He passed soon after that, and we found out that his name wasn't Howie. His name was Hartmut. He was born in Germany. His dad was an American GI. He was raised in Canada. He served in the Army himself, and he moved to San Jose. 1975, he's living in San Jose. He meets Timbers fans who are down there for the soccer bowl. And they say, you should come up and visit us in Portland. And he came up and he moved here. And he stayed here and he helped found the Timbers Army. And his name was Bless. And we're going to name a field after him that kids from 22 countries are going to get to play on. That's my Oregon story. That's the book I'm going to write.
And it sounds like you're also working your legacy.
Oh, yeah. Who do things for posterity. But what has posterity ever done for us, right? Right. Not at all.
If somebody else doesn't have one. Why biography? About biography and entertainment. The entertainers. Why that for you?
At the time I started writing books, I had been working at film magazines in Los Angeles. I worked at Box Office Magazine and then American Film Magazine. I knew people who wrote books about entertainment subjects. I used to read galleys of books for possible excerpts in my magazine. So I was in that world. I grew up a movie buff. There was a moment after American Film went out of business, and my then wife and I had these little kids, and we were living in Southern California. We didn't belong there, really. We were there for grad school and work, and both of those were done. When I could have become a sports writer, because I love sports. But I wanted to write for a living, and I lucked out. I went into a pub in 1986 after seeing a movie, and I ran into a former student of mine. As a grad student, I taught creative writing to undergraduate students. And he had become the editor of a freebie newspaper in Newport Beach, the Newport Center News. And he said, you should write for my... Oh, he had just come out of the same movie, and we were having a pint and playing pool and talking. And he says, you should write for me. I said, I'm a poet. I'm not going to write for a newspaper. He says, but listen to the way you just talked about movies. You should write movie reviews for me. I thought I could write movie reviews. And he paid me in restaurant coupons. I'd get 3 $15 coupons for every review. And these were to restaurants that we couldn't afford. So we had to wait until I wrote 3 reviews before we could go out to dinner, because dinner for 2 at these places was like $75, $100, you know?
That's awesome.
So, you know, I stumbled into it. I mean, I was very lucky, very lucky.
And I really appreciate what you shared tonight about the how-to of your work. I don't hear that kind of instruction.
Yeah, you know.
Often in a book, you know, review or whatever we call this. It's really great.
Thank you. Come see Karen Carbo next month. She is, as advertised, one of the funniest people in Portland. A great writer and an inspiration. So check her out. And thank you again. I know it was a warm night. We could have been outside.